He was an active-duty Navy SEAL on short leave, returning to a snowbound Montana town, expecting nothing more than a few quiet days away from duty. Then Daniel Carter walked into a struggling animal shelter and saw a retired German Shepherd canine sitting motionless at the end of the kennels, staring at the same door he had watched for 6 months. Ranger barely ate. He barely slept. His handler, Deputy Jake Miller, had vanished in the mountains and was officially accused of walking away. But when Daniel approached, Ranger suddenly stood. Hidden beneath his worn collar was a scratched metal message.
The tag was old,
"If I don't return,
worn,
follow
but
him."
the message was clear.
By nightfall,
Ranger
Daniel
wasn't
learned
just a
emergency
dog.
supplies were disappearing
He was
across the
evidence.
county, and Jake had been
Delivery was
investigating the
supposed to
same
arrive
shipments
yesterday.
before
It's
he
marked
vanished.
delivered, but it's not here.
Ranger wasn't
These
waiting
lists
to be
confirm the
rescued.
discrepancy.
He was
That
waiting
means
for
the
someone
supplies are
willing to
gone.
follow.
Look here. These missing
Before we
delivery
begin,
markings, they all
tell me,
follow the same pattern
where
along
are
the
you
supply
watching
routes.
from?
And they connect right here.
If stories
near
of
where Jake
loyalty,
vanished.
faith, and second chances mean something to you, subscribe and join us. God bless you. And snow had swallowed Pine Hollow, Montana, beneath a hard white sky, and wind drove powder across the road until the town seemed half erased. Daniel Carter arrived just after noon. At 37, Daniel was an active-duty Navy SEAL with a lean, muscular build, broad shoulders, an angular, square jaw, blue-gray eyes, short, dark brown, high-fade hair, and light stubble. He wore his NWU Type 3 AOR2 blouse and trousers, coyote brown belt, and brown military boots. Daniel had returned on short leave, expecting silence at his family's old cabin. Yet when he heard the local shelter needed help before the storm closed the roads, rest suddenly felt less important. The Pine Hollow Animal Shelter stood near the northern edge of town, surrounded by snow-packed fencing. Sarah Mitchell met Daniel at the service entrance. She was 34, tall and slender, with fair skin, shoulder-length chestnut hair tied in a loose ponytail, hazel eyes, and a composed face carrying obvious fatigue. A veterinarian by training, Sarah had taken over most daily shelter duties after staffing shortages. Years of treating frightened animals had made her gentle but decisive. Daniel noticed the exhaustion beneath her calm expression. She noticed that he immediately reached for the heaviest crate. Together they moved food, medicine, blankets, and a portable generator into storage, while the wind rattled the walls. Daniel was stacking the final bags when he noticed one kennel at the far end remained completely silent. Ranger, a 7-year-old German Shepherd canine, sat inside without barking or pacing. He was powerfully built despite losing weight, with a deep, matte black saddle, solid black facial mask, warm, tan legs and chest, amber eyes, and an old working collar beneath thick fur. Ranger stared at the front door. Daniel had seen trained dogs wake before, but this felt different. Ranger did not look hopeful or defeated. He looked committed. The sight stirred something Daniel understood too well. Waiting could seem passive to outsiders, but sometimes waiting was simply another form of duty. Sarah explained that Ranger had served in search and rescue with Deputy Jake Miller. Jake was 42, broad-shouldered with sandy brown hair, a weathered, square face, a short, trimmed beard, and steady gray eyes. Colleagues remembered him as patient under pressure and fiercely protective of Ranger, whom he treated as a partner. 6 months earlier, Jake disappeared during a mountain assignment. The official report claimed he had voluntarily abandoned duty. Ranger was found alone several days later near an old service road and eventually transferred to the shelter. Daniel resisted the explanation. A handler who spent years building this level of trust did not casually leave his canine behind. Ranger looked less like a dog abandoned by someone than a dog still expecting an unfinished mission to continue. Daniel approached without reaching through the bars. Ranger's amber eyes shifted from the entrance to Daniel, and Sarah quietly inhaled. Daniel crouched, hands loose on his knees. Ranger's body looked tired, but there was no fear or surrender in it. Daniel felt an old instinct return, the habit of reading silence as carefully as words. He remembered long hours waiting for signals and the discipline required to remain ready while nothing happened. "You're not done, are you?" Daniel murmured. Ranger blinked once, then rose. Sarah whispered that Ranger had barely responded to anyone for weeks. Daniel watched the German shepherd cross the kennel and stop directly in front of him, alert but strangely calm. As Ranger moved closer, Daniel noticed a dull, metallic glint beneath the fur at his throat. A small plate had been fixed beneath the ordinary collar hardware, where it was difficult to notice. Sarah said the collar had arrived with Ranger, and because he became uneasy whenever staff tried to remove it, they had left it alone. Daniel raised one hand slowly and waited. Ranger watched him, then lowered his head. Daniel separated the thick fur and exposed a scratched metal plate, worn smooth at the edges. Uneven letters had been cut into it by hand. Daniel's first reaction was caution. Messages deliberately hidden on working equipment existed for a reason. He angled the plate toward the fluorescent light while Ranger remained still. Daniel read the engraving twice. "If I don't return, follow him." Sarah repeated the words under her breath. Ranger kept his eyes on Daniel, then released a low breath and shifted closer to the gate. The message named no destination and no person. It seemed to assume Ranger would know what came next. More troubling was the first half. Whoever carved it had considered the possibility of never returning. Daniel wondered whether Jake had made it before his final assignment, but refused to turn suspicion into fact. Still, Ranger had spent 6 months watching a door and had now stood for Daniel. Responsibility settled over him with uncomfortable familiarity. He had come home to step away from duty, yet duty appeared to have found him first. The storm darkened the windows as Sarah admitted another problem. Their shelves were running dangerously low on food, veterinary medicine, heating fuel, and generator parts. County records showed every scheduled winter shipment as delivered in full, but Sarah insisted much of it had never arrived. At first she blamed paperwork errors and weather delays. Then the shortages became too regular to dismiss. Daniel looked toward the half-empty storage room and then at Ranger. He had no evidence connecting the missing supplies to Jake Miller, and his training warned him not to build conclusions from coincidence. Even so, the timing stayed in his mind. Outside, snow erased the road beyond the shelter. Inside, Ranger finally turned away from the entrance and sat facing Daniel instead. By morning, the storm had weakened enough for Pine Hollow to emerge beneath a pale gray sky. Daniel Carter had slept less than 2 hours. The words carved beneath Ranger's collar kept returning whenever he closed his eyes. "If I don't return, follow him." Daniel understood the danger of forcing meaning onto incomplete evidence, yet something about the message resisted being dismissed. After years of military service, he had learned that instinct was useful only when discipline controlled it. So instead of assuming Jake Miller had been betrayed, captured, or killed, Daniel decided to begin with the simplest question possible. What kind of man had Jake actually been? Sarah gave Daniel the name of Deputy Tom Harris, one of the few officers who had worked alongside Jake for years. Before leaving the shelter, Daniel stopped beside Ranger's kennel. The German shepherd was no longer staring continuously at the entrance. He watched Daniel now, silent and alert, as if measuring whether the man from yesterday intended to keep moving. Tom Harris met Daniel at a small sheriff's substation near the center of Pine Hollow. At 46, Tom was a solidly built man with broad forearms, brown hair heavily streaked with gray at the temples, dark green eyes, a blunt, square jaw, and a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. He wore a standard dark navy deputy uniform beneath a winter duty vest and carried himself with the wary patience of someone who had spent years listening before speaking. Tom had become more guarded after several difficult mountain recoveries early in his career, experiences that taught him how quickly incomplete facts could destroy reputations. When Daniel mentioned Jake Miller, Tom's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not refuse to talk, but he made the limits clear. The official case had been closed months earlier, and Daniel was neither law enforcement nor assigned to any investigation. Daniel accepted that without argument. He wanted context, not access. That restraint seemed to matter to Tom. After a long pause, the deputy motioned toward an empty chair and said, "Then ask me what you can't learn from a report." Daniel began with Ranger. Tom's resistance softened immediately. He described Jake and Ranger as one of the most dependable search teams in the county, especially during winter rescues when visibility dropped and human tracks disappeared beneath fresh snow. Jake had never treated Ranger like equipment. He checked the dog's paws himself after every mission, carried extra water even when it added weight, and refused to rotate Ranger into unnecessary assignments simply to satisfy supervisors. Tom remembered one rescue when Jake had spent nearly 7 hours beside Ranger in freezing conditions rather than send the dog back alone. "That man could be stubborn enough to argue with a mountain," Tom said. But he would not abandon that dog. The official explanation claimed Jake voluntarily left duty after becoming increasingly difficult with supervisors. Tom admitted Jake had become tense in his final weeks, but not unstable. He had been angry because he believed something was wrong with county supply shipments. Daniel listened without interrupting. For the first time, the mystery had a direction that did not depend on imagination. Tom explained that Jake had started paying attention to deliveries from North Ridge Rescue Depot, a county-contracted logistics hub positioned higher in the mountains. The depot distributed emergency fuel, portable generators, heating equipment, medical supplies, food, blankets, and rescue gear to remote stations across the region. Jake noticed inconsistencies because canine teams were often assigned to assist during winter emergencies, and he repeatedly arrived at locations where supposedly delivered equipment was missing. At first he thought delays caused the problem. Then he started comparing field conditions with delivery summaries. The numbers did not match. A station listed as receiving 4 heaters had only 2. Fuel marked delivered never reached one volunteer rescue post. Generator parts appeared on invoices even when local crews said they had been waiting weeks. Jake began asking questions outside his normal responsibilities. Soon afterward, his access to certain logistics records was reduced, and he was removed from several mountain assignments where he would normally have worked. Tom had warned him to be careful. Jake's answer had been simple. If supplies were missing during a Montana winter, paperwork was no longer just paperwork. Daniel asked what happened on Jake's final assignment. Tom did not have the classified details, but he had retained a copy of a routine dispatch summary because he had been scheduled as backup that day. The document contained nothing sensitive enough to restrict Daniel from hearing its basic contents. Jake and Ranger had been sent toward a service corridor north of Pine Hollow after a communication issue involving a county vehicle. Weather deteriorated quickly. Several hours later, radio contact with Jake was lost. Search personnel located Ranger days afterward near an old mountain road, but Jake was nowhere nearby. What bothered Tom was the behavior described in the recovery report. Ranger had resisted being loaded into the vehicle and repeatedly tried to return north. Tom opened a thin folder and pointed to one line from the incident summary. Ranger refused extraction, continued tracking north. Daniel read it twice. A lost dog might wander. A frightened dog might run. A trained canine repeatedly attempting to move in one direction suggested purpose. Daniel looked up. Did anyone follow him? Tom's silence answered before his words did. Tom explained that worsening weather, limited personnel, and instructions from command shifted the search away from Ranger's chosen route. The dog was eventually secured and transported back. Jake's disappearance was later categorized as voluntary absence after investigators found no confirmed evidence of an accident. Tom never accepted that conclusion. Jake's truck remained accounted for, his personal belongings were largely untouched, and he had made no known preparations to leave Pine Hollow permanently. More importantly, Jake had spent years building Ranger to operate through trust. Walking away from the dog without explanation contradicted everything Tom knew about him. Daniel felt anger beginning to rise, but he pushed it aside. Anger could turn uncertainty into certainty too quickly. He asked whether Jake had mentioned Northridge directly before disappearing. Tom nodded. 3 days before the final assignment, Jake had said he believed the missing shipments were not random bookkeeping failures. He claimed several shortages shared the same transport chain. Tom had told him to document everything before accusing anyone. Jake agreed. Then he vanished before showing Tom what he had collected. While Daniel was speaking with Tom, Sarah spent the morning in the shelter office, reviewing invoices she had ignored during months of staffing shortages. She spread delivery records across a folding table and compared them with handwritten inventory notes. The discrepancies were larger than she expected. Bags of working dog food listed as delivered were absent. Veterinary antibiotics had been billed in quantities she had never received. 2 replacement heating units appeared on county records, even though the shelter's maintenance log clearly showed that only 1 had arrived. Sarah had initially blamed storms, clerical mistakes, or emergency reallocations. Now she checked each shipment's routing code. The same name kept appearing in the paperwork: Northridge Rescue Depot. When Daniel returned with Tom's account, Sarah placed 3 invoices in front of him without saying anything. Daniel recognized the depot name immediately. The missing shelter supplies and Jake's unanswered questions were no longer separate problems. They touched the same point in the system. Daniel looked through the office window toward Ranger, who had risen from his blanket and was watching him again. For the first time, Daniel wondered whether Jake's disappearance had begun not on the mountain, but with something as ordinary as a delivery list. By late morning, another wall of snow was building over Black Timber Pass, turning the northern mountains into pale shapes beneath a darkening sky. Daniel Carter stood outside Pine Hollow Animal Shelter with Ranger beside him, waiting while Sarah checked the temporary release form one final time. Daniel had asked for only a few hours. He wanted to see whether Ranger would react to familiar roads, rather than force the dog toward any location Daniel had already chosen. Sarah agreed reluctantly, warning that the Weather Service expected conditions to deteriorate before evening. Ranger seemed to understand that something had changed. The 7-year-old German Shepherd no longer carried the withdrawn posture Daniel had seen inside the kennel. His amber eyes were sharp, his ears upright, and his lean working body held a quiet tension beneath the deep black saddle and warm tan coat. When Daniel opened the passenger door of his pickup, Ranger did not hesitate. He jumped inside, faced forward, and remained completely still until they reached the northern edge of Pine Hollow. Daniel stopped near the service road where Ranger had reportedly been recovered 6 months earlier. He clipped a long working lead to the dog's old collar, but did not direct him. For several seconds, Ranger simply stood in the snow, nose raised into the wind. Then, his entire posture changed. The German Shepherd turned north and began walking with controlled urgency, testing the air every few yards before continuing. Daniel followed, feeling the same uncomfortable pull that had begun when he first read the message beneath Ranger's collar. This was not random wandering. Ranger ignored animal tracks, abandoned buildings, and the easier road back toward town. He chose a narrow maintenance route, climbing steadily toward Black Timber Pass. Snow had nearly erased the old tire ruts, and pine branches bent beneath heavy ice. Daniel reminded himself that training could preserve patterns for years, but memory was not proof. Still, the farther Ranger moved, the more certain he seemed. Daniel stopped trying to interpret the dog's emotions and concentrated on one simple fact. Ranger knew this road. Nearly 40 minutes later, the maintenance route became too narrow for the pickup. Daniel parked in a sheltered turnout, checked the storm clouds gathering over the ridge, and continued on foot. Ranger pulled only enough to maintain direction, never fighting the lead. The wind strengthened as they climbed, driving loose snow across the slope and reducing visibility. Daniel considered turning back twice. He had no authority to conduct an investigation on the mountain, and trusting a canine did not make bad weather harmless. Yet each time he slowed, Ranger stopped and looked back rather than continuing alone. The behavior affected Daniel more than he expected. Ranger was not dragging him into danger. The dog appeared to be asking whether Daniel was still willing to follow. That distinction mattered. Daniel finally made a private limit for himself. One more location, then they would return before the storm sealed the road. Ranger resumed moving almost immediately and led him toward the outline of an abandoned ranger station barely visible through the trees. The station was a small timber structure leaning beneath years of snow, its windows clouded with frost and one section of the roof sagging under ice. Daniel tested the front door and found it unsecured. Inside, the air smelled of old wood, dust, and cold metal. Ranger entered first, but did not behave as though the place were unfamiliar. He moved directly past the empty desk toward a back room, then stopped beside a rusted shelf. Daniel noticed a single dark brown glove partly hidden behind a fallen box. The material was weathered, but a faded sheriff's insignia remained stitched near the wrist. Nearby lay 2 depleted radio batteries of the type used in older county field equipment. Daniel felt his pulse tighten. Neither item proved Jake had been there, but together they made coincidence harder to accept. Ranger lowered his nose to the glove, inhaled once, and became completely still. His ears softened backward for a moment. Daniel did not need to imagine grief to recognize familiarity. Whatever this place meant to Ranger, it was personal. Behind the shelf, Daniel found a folded transportation map pinned beneath a broken clipboard. Several county service roads had been marked in pencil, along with strings of container numbers written beside Northridge routes. Daniel photographed the page, rather than removing it immediately. Then one sequence caught his attention. He remembered seeing nearly the same number on an invoice Sarah had placed before him that morning. Daniel called her from the station, where the signal faded in and out, and slowly read the digits. Sarah searched her copied records and confirmed the match. The container had supposedly carried replacement generator components and heating equipment destined for Pine Hollow Animal Shelter, yet only part of that shipment had ever arrived. Another number matched a veterinary supply order that Sarah had been unable to account for. Daniel stared at the map as the storm rattled the walls. Jake had not merely suspected that supplies were disappearing. He had been recording specific containers. Sarah's missing inventory had now become independent support for something Jake appeared to have noticed months earlier. Ranger suddenly left Daniel's side and moved toward the corner of the room. He scratched once at the floor, stopped, then scratched again with more insistence. One plank sat slightly higher than those around it. Daniel knelt and examined the gap, finding that the board had already been loosened long ago. He lifted it carefully and discovered a shallow cavity beneath the floor. Inside rested a small metal box wrapped in an old waterproof evidence bag. Daniel opened it and found a damaged USB drive, its casing cracked along one edge, and a folded scrap of paper protected inside clear plastic. The handwriting was firm but rushed. Only one sentence had been written. "Don't trust the inventory records." Daniel read it slowly. The words did not identify a thief, accuse Northridge, or explain Jake's disappearance. That restraint made the message more convincing, not less. Jake had apparently been leaving breadcrumbs rather than conclusions. Daniel slipped the USB and note into the bag again, intending to give them to Tom rather than attempt to access anything himself. An engine sounded outside. Ranger froze before Daniel fully registered the noise. His body lowered slightly, ears angled toward the front of the station. Through a narrow gap beside the frosted window, Daniel saw a dark SUV moving slowly along the buried service road. It stopped beside the station. 2 adult men stepped out. The first appeared tall and heavyset, wearing a dark insulated work coat and knit cap. The second was shorter, broad through the shoulders, with a gray winter jacket and thick gloves. Their faces were obscured by blowing snow, and Daniel could not identify either one. What disturbed him was their behavior. They did not look lost, study a map, or search the surrounding area. Both men walked directly toward the station. Daniel felt his instincts sharpen, but he resisted the impulse to confront strangers when he had no idea who they were or why they had come. His goal was no longer to learn more. It was to preserve what Jake had hidden and get Ranger safely off the mountain. Daniel returned the loose floorboard to its original position, secured the evidence bag inside his pack, and moved with Ranger toward a rear utility door partially blocked by snow. The wind outside had become stronger, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they moved away from the structure. Daniel did not know whether the approaching men had seen his pickup farther down the road, whether they were connected to Northridge, or whether their arrival had an innocent explanation. He refused to turn uncertainty into accusation. Still, the timing was impossible to ignore. Ranger remained close as they descended through the trees toward the service route, glancing back only once at the ranger station, disappearing behind the storm. Daniel thought about Jake's handwritten warning, the matching container numbers, and the fact that someone had arrived at an abandoned building within minutes of the hidden box being discovered. 6 months had passed since Jake Miller vanished. Yet somebody still seemed interested in the places he had left behind. Daniel reached Pine Hollow shortly before darkness settled over the valley. Snow clung to the sides of his pickup, and Ranger remained upright in the passenger seat, watching every intersection as though the mountain had followed them back into town. Daniel drove directly to the sheriff's substation rather than the cabin. During the final minutes inside the abandoned ranger station, he had managed to note the dark SUV's license plate through the frosted window before leaving through the rear door. He gave the number to Tom Harris along with the damaged USB, Jake's handwritten warning, and photographs of the transportation map. Tom's expression grew more serious as Daniel described the two men approaching the station. Neither man had threatened them, Daniel emphasized, and he had no evidence they had done anything illegal. Tom appreciated the distinction. He entered the plate through the county system and found the vehicle registered to a private freight contractor that had received repeated winter transportation work connected to Northridge Rescue Depot. The information did not prove wrongdoing, but it made the coincidence difficult to dismiss. The next morning, Sarah Mitchell arrived at the shelter before sunrise and immediately noticed something wrong with the office computer. The inventory program had been left open on a screen she never used, and several recently accessed folders showed modification times from the middle of the night. Sarah was not a technology specialist, but years of managing limited shelter resources had made her meticulous with records. She checked the local backup and felt a cold pressure settle behind her ribs. Ranger's complete intake file was gone from the active database. Medical notes remained, but the transfer history, recovery location, original caller description, and older canine documentation had been deleted. Sarah called Daniel before contacting anyone else because she knew the timing mattered. Less than 3 hours later, another message arrived through the county administrative system. Ranger had been approved for transfer to an out-of-state behavioral facility for what the document called long-term adaptability assessment. Sarah read the phrase twice. No veterinarian had requested the evaluation. No one had discussed moving Ranger. Yet the order instructed the shelter to prepare him for transport within 48 hours. Daniel found Sarah standing beside Ranger's kennel with the printed transfer order clenched in one hand. Anger made her usually composed hazel eyes unusually hard. She explained that legitimate transfers normally required consultation, medical clearance, and advanced scheduling. This one had appeared without any of those steps. Ranger sat close to the gate, observing them quietly. Daniel refused to assume the order came from whoever had accessed the computer, but the sequence troubled him. Jake's hidden evidence had been recovered one afternoon. Ranger's records disappeared that night. A transfer order followed the next morning. Daniel asked Sarah to preserve the document, make copies, and avoid altering the computer until Tom could arrange for it to be examined properly. Sarah nodded, then admitted something that disturbed her more than the missing file. Ranger had spent 6 months largely ignored. Suddenly, less than a day after returning from Black Timber Pass, someone in the system had decided his location mattered. Daniel looked at the German Shepherd. For the first time, the possibility that Ranger himself represented a loose end no longer felt unreasonable. Instead of waiting for another record to disappear, Sarah began copying every paper invoice still stored in the shelter's filing cabinets. She worked from handwritten receiving logs rather than relying only on the computer. By midday, patterns emerged. The shelter was not the only facility reporting shortages. Sarah called several adult coordinators she knew through regional animal and emergency response networks. A mountain rescue station had been billed for 3 portable generators, but documented receiving only 2. A volunteer response unit had signed for a shipment containing insulated heating cylinders, yet half the listed equipment never reached its storage building. Another rural clinic had repeatedly received fewer medical packages than county paperwork showed. None of these shortages seemed dramatic alone. Together, they formed something harder to explain as routine error. Sarah created a separate list showing dates, order numbers, delivery quantities, and the locations where items had gone missing. Nearly every questionable shipment had passed through Northridge Rescue Depot before being marked complete. The shelter's financial problems suddenly looked different. It had not merely been unlucky. It appeared to be one small destination inside a much larger pattern. Tom joined Daniel and Sarah that afternoon with several publicly accessible contract summaries and internal records he was permitted to review. The freight company tied to the SUV had received regular hauling assignments for Northridge, especially during periods when snow disrupted normal county transportation. Tom pointed out that private contractors were common during severe winters, so the relationship itself was not suspicious. What mattered was the overlap. Several shipments Sarah had flagged appeared on routes handled by the same contractor. Daniel compared those documents with the container numbers photographed at the ranger station. The matches were not complete enough to identify who redirected the supplies, but the structure was beginning to emerge. Goods were recorded at Northridge, transferred to private transport, and later listed as successfully delivered, even when receiving sites reported shortages. Jake had been tracing those exact gaps before he vanished. Daniel felt the pieces pulling toward a conclusion, but he stopped himself. A pattern showed where to look. It did not yet show who was responsible. One name appeared repeatedly at the bottom of the final winter distribution reports: Captain Robert Kane. Kane was 54, tall and broad-chested, with close-cropped silver hair, pale blue eyes, a deeply lined rectangular face, and a clean-shaven jaw that made his expression look almost permanently controlled. He had spent more than 2 decades in county emergency coordination and was widely respected for remaining calm during blizzards, road closures, and mountain rescue operations. Years earlier, Kane had helped reorganize the county's winter response network after a storm stranded several remote crews, and that success had built him a reputation as the man who kept Pine Hollow functioning when weather shut everything else down. Sarah knew his name from community fundraisers. Tom had worked under his coordination during rescue operations and had never personally seen him behave recklessly or dishonestly. Daniel studied Kane's approvals carefully. Most of the questionable delivery reports carried his authorization somewhere in the chain, but Daniel immediately pointed out that senior officials often signed documents prepared by others. A signature could indicate responsibility, negligence, or nothing more than routine procedure. They needed evidence before turning a respected public figure into a suspect. The more records Sarah compared, however, the clearer Jake's concerns became. Missing supplies were not limited to expensive equipment that might attract attention. Dog food, veterinary medicine, heater parts, fuel containers, blankets, and replacement batteries had all disappeared in small enough quantities to look like mistakes. That method explained why the losses had remained invisible for so long. No single facility had lost enough to trigger a major investigation, but combined shortages represented a substantial amount of public inventory. Sarah looked around the shelter's half-stocked storage room and realized those missing deliveries had pushed her closer to shutting kennels during the coldest part of winter. Daniel saw how personal the problem had become for her. This was no longer an abstract logistics discrepancy. Animals had gone without supplies. Rescue crews had worked with reduced equipment. And Jake may have placed himself at risk because he refused to ignore the pattern. Still, Daniel reminded them that they did not yet know whether Northridge employees, contractors, administrators, or several people working together were responsible. Before leaving that evening, Tom arranged for the Ranger transfer order to be temporarily held, pending verification of its origin. He also secured copies of Sarah's paper records and the computer activity information for proper review. Daniel stood beside Ranger's kennel as the shelter quieted around them. The German Shepherd was no longer staring at the front door. His amber eyes followed Daniel instead. Somewhere between the hidden container numbers, the deleted K9 file, and the sudden transfer order, two mysteries had become one. Jake had been examining missing winter supplies before he disappeared. Sarah's shelter had been losing those same supplies through the same distribution network, and now Ranger, the one living partner who might still remember Jake's final route, was being moved away just as those connections surfaced. Daniel rested his fingers briefly against the kennel gate. He still did not know who was behind it. He did know one thing. Whatever Jake had discovered had not ended 6 months ago. The damaged USB was examined the next morning by Mason Reed, a 39-year-old digital evidence technician Tom Harris had trusted for more than a decade. Mason was a lean man of medium height with pale skin, narrow brown eyes, short black hair beginning to gray above the ears, and a carefully trimmed dark beard. He spoke slowly, disliked speculation, and had developed an almost stubborn respect for damaged evidence after an early case in his career had been nearly ruined by careless handling. Mason warned Daniel and Tom that the cracked drive might contain only fragments, but several hours later he recovered enough files to establish a pattern. There were equipment serial numbers, photographs of freight trucks entering mountain service roads long after scheduled delivery hours, and a set of GPS coordinates labeled only by dates. Sarah compared the serial numbers with her paper records and found multiple exact matches. Some belonged to generators and heating equipment that county reports claimed had already been delivered. The final GPS point lay deep inside Black Timber Pass, at an old maintenance depot officially closed 6 months earlier after an avalanche damaged the access road. Tom wanted to wait for better weather, but the forecast made delay risky. Another major storm was expected to close the northern routes by evening, possibly for several days. With authorization from the sheriff's office to inspect county property connected to the recovered records, Tom drove a four-wheel drive utility truck while Daniel sat beside him and Ranger rode in the rear compartment. Sarah remained in Pine Hollow with copies of the serial lists, ready to verify anything they found. Daniel appreciated the arrangement. This was no longer simply his private suspicion about a dog and a missing handler. Tom had a legitimate reason to inspect the site, and every step now had someone accountable for it. The farther they climbed toward Black Timber Pass, the more Ranger changed. The German Shepherd stood rigidly behind them, amber eyes fixed through the windshield. Snow covered the road in long, wind-driven sheets. But whenever Tom slowed at an intersection, Ranger shifted toward the same northern branch shown in Jake's recovered GPS data. Daniel felt the old uneasiness return. Ranger was not discovering this route. He was remembering it. The maintenance depot stood in a narrow basin between pine-covered slopes, half buried behind snowdrifts and surrounded by rusted fencing. One side of the corrugated roof had collapsed beneath old avalanche debris, but the main storage structure remained intact. Tom checked the county seal on the door before entering. Inside, their flashlights revealed rows of wooden pallets covered by dust and frozen moisture. At first, Daniel saw nothing unusual. Then, Tom pulled back a heavy canvas sheet and exposed several county-marked shipping crates. The labels showed destinations scattered across Pine Hollow and neighboring rescue districts. Sarah answered Tom's call immediately and began reading numbers from her copies. The first generator matched a unit listed as delivered to a mountain rescue post 4 months earlier. 2 portable heaters matched equipment supposedly received by another response station. A sealed crate of veterinary supplies carried an order number connected to Pine Hollow Animal Shelter. Daniel stared at the untouched boxes. Jake had not merely found accounting errors. Someone had physically diverted public emergency supplies and stored them where receiving facilities would never see them. Tom photographed every crate and contacted the sheriff's office to document the location before anything was moved. Daniel noticed Ranger had almost no interest in the stored equipment. The German Shepherd sniffed briefly near the pallets, then turned away and moved toward a damaged rear section of the building. His breathing quickened. Daniel followed while Tom continued recording serial numbers. Behind a collapsed maintenance bay, snow had blown through a broken wall and buried most of an old vehicle under timber and roofing material. Only part of the driver's door remained visible. Ranger stopped beside it and sat. His posture became strangely formal, almost identical to the disciplined stance Daniel had seen inside the shelter. Tom cleared snow from the door and froze when the faded county markings appeared beneath the ice. It was an older sheriff's patrol vehicle. The identification number matched a vehicle assigned to Jake Miller shortly before his disappearance. Daniel felt his chest tighten. 6 months of official uncertainty suddenly narrowed to one physical place. Ranger had not brought them to random evidence. He had brought them back to Jake's last known vehicle. The vehicle interior had been exposed to cold but remained surprisingly intact beneath the collapsed roof. Tom searched it methodically, rather than allowing Daniel to disturb anything. The glove compartment contained routine forms, an empty flashlight mount, and old road maps. Beneath the passenger seat, however, Ranger began pawing lightly at the floor. Tom found a small maintenance panel that had been loosened and then pressed back into place. Inside was a damaged body camera wrapped in plastic. Daniel immediately recognized the logic. Jake had hidden the device in the patrol vehicle rather than carrying it while trying to leave the area. Mason had already traveled part way toward Black Timber Pass after Tom called him about the storage discovery, and by late afternoon he reached the depot with a portable evidence kit. The body camera itself would not power on, but Mason extracted its internal storage card and recovered several short video fragments. Most showed darkness, snow, and portions of Jake's uniform. Then, one segment opened with voices inside what appeared to be the same maintenance building. Jake Miller was visible only briefly in the damaged footage, but his voice was clear. He accused several unidentified men of redirecting county shipments and falsifying destination records. Another man ordered Jake to stop asking questions and surrender whatever records he had collected. Daniel watched Tom's expression change before he recognized the voice himself. It belonged to Captain Robert Kane. Kane did not confess to stealing anything in the recovered footage, nor did he explain his role, but his presence at a closed maintenance depot while Jake confronted people about missing supplies was impossible to ignore. Jake refused to hand over his records. The recording shook as he moved toward the exit. Voices rose behind him, but the damaged file dropped sections of audio. Then Jake's command cut through clearly. "Ranger, go!" A dog barked once. The camera image swung toward the snow outside, blurred violently, and stopped. Mason tried the remaining fragments, but none showed what happened afterward. Tom stared at the frozen frame. Daniel felt a heavy certainty forming that he did not want to accept. Perhaps they had found the place where Jake's story ended. Ranger refused that conclusion. While Tom secured the body camera and Mason packed his equipment, the German Shepherd rose abruptly and moved away from the patrol vehicle. Daniel called him back, but Ranger pulled toward an opening in the damaged rear wall. His nose dropped to the snow, then lifted toward the trees beyond the depot. The dog began straining against the lead with an urgency Daniel had not seen before. Tom looked toward the forest and then at the recovered GPS information. There were no additional coordinates beyond the maintenance depot. As far as Jake's files were concerned, the trail stopped here. Ranger behaved as though it did not. Daniel followed him outside several yards before stopping at the edge of the trees. Beneath fresh snow, he could barely make out the depression of an old service path disappearing deeper into Black Timber Pass. Ranger stood facing it, body tense, waiting. Daniel finally understood the mistake they had nearly made. The patrol vehicle and body camera were not necessarily the end of Jake's route. Jake had ordered Ranger to run, but Ranger had survived long enough to be found miles away. The dog remembered what happened after the camera stopped. Daniel looked back at Tom, then down at Ranger. For 6 months, everyone had treated the German Shepherd's behavior as grief. Daniel now saw something else beneath it. Memory, direction, duty. Jake's body camera had given them evidence that Captain Kane was present during the confrontation over missing supplies, but it had not explained Jake's fate. Ranger might still be the only living witness capable of showing them where Jake went next. The wind strengthened across the basin as the approaching storm began swallowing the upper ridge. Daniel tightened his grip on the lead. Ranger did not look toward the depot again. He stared only into the forest, toward the old path disappearing beneath snow. Jake's trail had not ended at the abandoned patrol vehicle. For Ranger, it had only changed direction. The storm closed over Black Timber Pass before Daniel, Tom, and Ranger had traveled half a mile beyond the abandoned maintenance depot. Snow moved almost sideways through the pines, erasing the old service path whenever the wind shifted. Tom Harris checked the time and warned that they had only a narrow window before returning safely would become difficult. Daniel understood the risk, but Ranger's behavior was unlike anything he had shown earlier. The German Shepherd moved with absolute certainty, nose low when the trail crossed sheltered ground and head raised whenever the wind carried scent through the trees. He never wandered or doubled back. At difficult sections he stopped, looked at Daniel, then continued only after Daniel reached him. Whatever memory Ranger was following had survived 6 months of isolation. Daniel felt the responsibility of that trust with increasing weight. They were no longer following a GPS coordinate or Jake's paperwork. They were following the last living witness to what had happened after the body camera stopped recording. The route climbed for nearly 2 hours before turning away from the main ridge and descending into a narrow bowl protected by dense timber. Tom nearly missed the structure until Ranger left the path and pushed through snow-covered brush. Hidden behind the trees stood an old weather station, smaller than Daniel expected, with a squat observation tower, boarded windows, and faded federal markings almost completely weathered away. Tom remembered the site only vaguely. It had been removed from active county maps years earlier, after automated weather equipment replaced the staffed station. Ranger approached the front door and immediately began scratching at the bottom panel. Daniel noticed something that changed the atmosphere at once. Fresh wood had been stacked beneath an overhang. The pieces were uneven, but recently split, protected from the snow by an old canvas sheet. A narrow ventilation pipe released the faintest trace of smoke. Someone was inside. Tom drew no conclusions, but his hand went to his radio, even though the mountain gave them only broken static. Daniel quietly called Ranger back and opened the door. Warm air carrying the smell of wood smoke and canned soup met them. The station looked abandoned from outside, but the interior told another story. A small table had been repaired with mismatched boards. Firewood had been divided into careful bundles against one wall. Empty food cans had been washed and stacked rather than thrown away. A first aid kit sat open beside rolls of bandage, and an old field radio had been disassembled on a workbench, its wiring exposed from repeated attempts at repair. Daniel saw blankets arranged near the stove and snow melt collected in metal containers. Whoever had lived here had survived through discipline rather than comfort. Ranger moved slowly through the main room, trembling in a way Daniel had never seen. Then the dog suddenly turned toward a narrow hallway. His ears flattened, and a low sound escaped him. Not warning, not fear, but something almost fragile. He pulled free of Daniel's loose grip and ran toward the rear room, paws sliding across the wooden floor as Daniel and Tom followed. A man rose unsteadily from a narrow cot as Ranger entered. For one suspended second, no one spoke. Jake Miller looked older than the photographs Daniel had seen. At 42, he still had the broad shoulders and square frame Tom had described, but months of isolation had thinned his face and sharpened the lines around his steady gray eyes. His sandy brown hair had grown unevenly over his ears, and his once neat beard was now thicker and streaked with pale strands. He wore layered work clothes repaired at the elbows and moved carefully on a left leg that had never fully recovered from an old injury. Yet his posture still carried the instinctive control of a deputy accustomed to emergencies. Ranger crossed the room and pressed his entire body against Jake. Jake dropped to one knee despite the pain and wrapped both arms around the German Shepherd's neck. Ranger made a small, broken sound and buried his head against Jake's chest. Daniel looked away for a moment, giving them the dignity of a reunion neither had expected to survive long enough to experience. When Jake finally looked up, suspicion appeared before relief. Tom identified himself and explained the recovered USB, the body camera, and Ranger's trail. Jake listened in silence until Daniel showed him the metal tag beneath Ranger's collar. The hardness in Jake's expression disappeared. He explained that, after discovering diverted rescue supplies, he had tried to assemble enough evidence to bypass the local distribution chain and reach investigators outside Kane's influence. The confrontation at the maintenance depot had happened before he was ready. Jake realized his records were being sought and ordered Ranger to run while he escaped through the rear service route. During the pursuit, Jake injured his leg crossing a steep drainage and lost his phone and working radio. He reached the weather station because he remembered it from an old mountain rescue. He had carved the message into Ranger's tag weeks earlier as a precaution. "If I don't return, follow him." Jake believed that if Ranger found another trained officer, rescuer, or experienced service member willing to trust the dog, Ranger might eventually lead that person back along the route. Jake had not survived entirely alone. During the first weeks, he had been discovered by Eli Turner, a 63-year-old retired weather technician who still checked the abandoned station occasionally. Eli was a short, wiry man with weathered brown skin, silver hair cut close to his scalp, clear blue eyes, and a narrow face framed by a white mustache. Decades of mountain work had made him practical, private, and deeply suspicious of unnecessary bureaucracy. Jake said Eli had brought canned food, medical supplies, batteries, and additional firewood while promising not to report his location until Jake could safely contact outside authorities. Eli also tried to repair the old radio. Then, successive storms damaged the lower access road and prevented his old snow vehicle from returning. Jake attempted to descend twice after his leg improved, but unstable snow and worsening weather forced him back. The station's emergency pantry, water system, and stored fuel kept him alive, though barely comfortably. More than once, Jake wondered whether Ranger had made it out at all. Tom asked why Jake had not risked approaching another county station once he became mobile. Jake's answer carried no pride, only exhaustion. He no longer knew which communication channels were safe. Kane's voice on the body camera had confirmed that someone with authority knew what Jake was investigating, and Jake feared that announcing his location through ordinary channels might destroy the remaining evidence before outside investigators could see it. His plan had been to wait until weather improved enough to reach a neighboring jurisdiction on foot, but repeated storms and his recovering leg kept narrowing that opportunity. Daniel understood the logic, even while recognizing how desperate it had become. Jake had not chosen isolation because he wanted to disappear. He had been balancing survival against the fear that returning through the same system he suspected would end the investigation permanently. Tom assured him that physical evidence had now been secured beyond Northridge's control. For the first time, Jake seemed to believe that hiding might finally be over. Ranger remained pressed against Jake throughout the conversation. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The rigid vigilance Daniel had seen at the shelter gradually faded from the dog's body. His breathing slowed, his ears relaxed. Eventually, Ranger lowered himself beside Jake's boots and rested his head across the man's foot, eyes half closed. Daniel finally understood what everyone in Pine Hollow had mistaken for grief. Ranger had not spent 6 months staring at the shelter door because he had given up. He had been waiting. Jake had given him a command without knowing who would eventually answer it, and Ranger had held on to that duty through hunger, confusion, strange kennels, and countless people walking past him. Daniel had not rescued Ranger from that shelter. Ranger had recruited Daniel into finishing a mission. Outside, the storm continued against the old weather station. But inside, for the first time in 6 months, neither Jake nor Ranger was waiting for the other to return. Jake Miller returned to Pine Hollow under medical supervision the following morning, riding in the rear of a county rescue vehicle with Ranger pressed against his leg. News of his survival was kept limited while Tom Harris contacted investigators outside the local emergency network. Jake was exhausted, thinner than anyone remembered, and still walked carefully on his left leg, but his mind remained remarkably organized. Years as a deputy had taught him to separate what he believed from what he could prove, and 6 months of isolation had strengthened that discipline rather than weakened it. At the clinic, while a physician examined his leg and dehydration, Jake asked Tom for paper, not a phone. He began rebuilding the sequence from memory. Missing shipment numbers, contractor names, dates, storage sites, and the people he had seen at Northridge. Daniel stayed nearby, but did not lead the process. He understood the line clearly. He had helped find Jake. What happened next belonged to law enforcement and investigators with legal authority. Tom brought in Special Agent Laura Bennett from the Montana Department of Justice to oversee the outside review. Laura was 41, medium height and athletic, with light olive skin, straight dark blonde hair cut just above her shoulders, cool gray eyes, and a narrow face that rarely revealed what she was thinking. She wore a charcoal field coat over practical dark clothing and spoke with careful precision. Early in her career, Laura had worked a public corruption investigation that collapsed after investigators moved too quickly and contaminated their own timeline. Since then, she had become almost obsessive about independent verification. She listened to Jake without interrupting, then separated his claims into categories: first-hand observations, recovered documents, digital evidence, and assumptions that still needed confirmation. Jake respected her immediately. He explained that Kane and several private contractors had exploited winter emergencies by inflating supply orders, diverting part of each shipment, and storing equipment temporarily before resale through private commercial channels. The scheme survived because no single shortage looked large enough to trigger alarm. Jake then revealed why time mattered. Before his disappearance, he had learned that Northridge was preparing one final transfer before the annual winter inventory review. Some remaining county equipment had never been sold, and several original paper manifests were still stored with it because altering every physical record would have created discrepancies elsewhere. The shipment was scheduled to leave Northridge that afternoon under a routine contractor movement. If those crates and documents disappeared, investigators would still have a case, but proving the full scale of the operation would become much harder. Laura did not rush to act. She compared Jake's statement with the USB coordinates, Mason Reed's recovered photographs, the body camera footage, Tom's vehicle records, and Sarah's receiving logs. Daniel provided a written statement describing the ranger station, the SUV, the hidden evidence, and Ranger's route, but made no request to participate in the operation. His SEAL training gave him useful instincts, but Pine Hollow was not his jurisdiction. He intended to respect that distinction completely. Sarah arrived, carrying 2 thick folders of copied shelter records. She had spent most of the night reorganizing invoices by delivery number instead of date, and that small decision exposed a pattern no one had noticed before. Several shipments marked as completed had sequential transport codes despite being listed as traveling to different destinations on different days. Laura placed Sarah's records beside Jake's serial list and found repeated matches. A generator, supposedly delivered to a mountain rescue station, appeared in Jake's photographs at the hidden depot. Heating equipment, billed to another response unit, carried the same serial prefix as crates recovered from the maintenance warehouse. Veterinary supplies assigned to Pine Hollow Animal Shelter were documented in both systems but had never reached Sarah. The shelter records mattered because they existed independently of Jake's investigation. Kane could argue Jake had misunderstood what he saw. He could claim the USB was incomplete. But Sarah's receiving logs had been created months earlier for ordinary administrative reasons. They showed the same missing inventory without any knowledge of Jake's evidence. By early afternoon, Laura had enough corroborating material to obtain the necessary authorization for investigators and county law enforcement to inspect Northridge and secure records connected to the suspected diversions. Tom joined the official team. Daniel remained at the sheriff's office with Jake, Ranger, and Sarah. That choice frustrated part of him. He had spent much of his adult life acting when a situation became dangerous, and sitting beside a window while others moved toward Northridge felt unnatural. Yet Daniel knew restraint was also discipline. Ranger seemed to understand better. The German Shepherd lay beside Jake's chair, finally able to rest without staring at a door. Through updates from Tom, they learned the final contractor truck had been stopped before leaving the Northridge property. Its cargo included county-marked generators, sealed heating units, emergency batteries, and equipment whose serial numbers matched items already listed as delivered elsewhere. Investigators also secured original manifests, duplicate invoices, and handwritten contractor routing sheets from an administrative storage room. Captain Robert Kane arrived, while investigators were still documenting the property. According to Tom's later account, Kane remained composed at first. He argued that private contractors controlled freight movement once shipments left the county loading area, and suggested that any diversion must have happened without his knowledge. Laura did not confront him with accusations. She asked him to explain specific approvals instead. Kane claimed some signatures were routine authorizations prepared by staff. That explanation might have carried weight if the records stood alone. They did not. The body camera placed Kane at the closed maintenance depot during Jake's confrontation. Jake's USB-connected, diverted serial numbers to specific routes. Physical equipment with those same serial numbers had been recovered from storage. Sarah's independent logs proved receiving locations never obtained the items. Finally, the paper manifests at Northridge showed repeated changes between initial inventory quantities and the numbers later reported as delivered. Each individual piece could have been challenged. Together, they formed a chain too consistent to dismiss as clerical error. Kane and several contractor personnel directly connected to the questioned transfers were detained for investigation, while authorities secured Northridge and began tracing the recovered property. No dramatic confrontation followed. There were no shouted confessions or violent resistance. Instead, the operation ended with cameras documenting crate numbers, investigators sealing records, and workers quietly being separated for interviews. Daniel found the restraint almost more powerful than spectacle. Jake had risked everything, not to win an argument, but to preserve facts long enough for someone independent to examine them. By evening, Tom returned with confirmation that the recovered inventory would be cataloged and redistributed to the facilities originally assigned to receive it. Pine Hollow Animal Shelter would recover equipment and supplies Sarah had assumed were permanently lost. Sarah closed her eyes for several seconds when she heard that. Months of shortages had nearly forced her to reduce the shelter's winter capacity. For the first time, she could imagine keeping every kennel heated through the season. The final news came after sunset. Laura informed Jake that the preliminary review had found no evidence supporting the earlier claim that he had voluntarily abandoned duty. His disappearance would be formally reclassified, and the disciplinary assumptions attached to his record were being suspended, pending full administrative correction. Jake did not celebrate. He simply lowered his head and rested one hand on Ranger's neck. For 6 months, the dog had carried the consequence of that false story without understanding why people stopped looking. Ranger leaned into Jake's palm and closed his amber eyes. Daniel watched the two of them and thought back to the silent kennel, the door Ranger never stopped watching, and the metal message nobody had noticed. Jake had wanted evidence to survive. Ranger had done more than that. He had carried the trail itself until someone finally followed. The investigation was not finished, and Kane's ultimate responsibility would be decided through proper legal process. But Jake Miller's name no longer belonged to the story of a deputy who abandoned his canine. It belonged to the man Ranger had refused to stop searching for. The final weeks of winter changed Pine Hollow more quietly than the investigation had. Snow still covered the roofs and fields, but the roads reopened, supply trucks returned to their proper routes, and the town no longer felt trapped beneath the same weight of suspicion. Jake Miller's record was formally corrected after investigators confirmed that he had not abandoned duty or Ranger. The county sheriff publicly thanked him for preserving evidence and for refusing to ignore missing emergency supplies when doing so would have been easier. Jake accepted the recognition without ceremony. At 42, he was still broad-shouldered and steady-eyed, but months in isolation had left him leaner, slower on his left leg, and more reflective than before. The experience had changed what duty meant to him. He no longer wanted to prove that he could return to the same demanding canine work. He wanted to make sure another working dog would never be forgotten simply because a handler disappeared or a file was closed. Pine Hollow Animal Shelter changed with him. The recovered equipment, replacement supplies, and restored county funding removed the immediate threat of shutting part of the facility. Sarah Mitchell stood in the storage room one morning, surrounded by boxes of veterinary medicine, working dog food, heater components, and blankets that should have arrived months earlier. For the first time that winter, the shelves looked prepared instead of depleted. Sarah used the renewed support to propose a small program for retired and displaced working dogs, focusing on medical assessment, behavioral recovery, and careful placement rather than treating former canines like ordinary abandoned animals. Jake offered to volunteer as an advisor once his health allowed it. His years with Ranger had taught him that trained dogs did not simply forget duty when a badge or assignment ended. They needed structure, patience, and people willing to understand the difference between aggression and vigilance, between withdrawal and waiting. Ranger underwent his own evaluation after the investigation stabilized. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had recovered weight and strength, his deep, matte black saddle once again dense across his back, his solid black facial mask sharp against the warm, tan fur of his chest and legs. His amber eyes no longer followed every doorway with the same relentless expectation. A veterinary and working dog assessment found him healthy enough for normal activity, but recommended retirement from formal operational duty after the stress and instability of the previous 6 months. Jake listened to the recommendation in silence, one hand resting on Ranger's neck. Part of him had always imagined the two of them returning to work together. Letting go of that future hurt more than he admitted. But he also knew Ranger had already given enough. The dog had survived the mountain, carried Jake's final instruction, endured the shelter, and led Daniel back through every piece of the unfinished trail. Retirement was not surrender. It was something Ranger had earned. Daniel Carter's leave was almost over. He had spent the final days helping Sarah repair storage shelving, driving Jake to medical appointments when needed, and taking Ranger on long walks beyond the edge of town. Daniel remained an active-duty Navy SEAL, and he knew his life would still involve deployments, training cycles, and periods when stability could not be guaranteed. That reality made him careful about what happened next. Ranger was not military property and would not become Daniel's operational canine. If Daniel accepted responsibility for him, It had to be as a personal companion, with proper ownership transfer, veterinary records, housing arrangements, and a support plan for the times Daniel's service obligations took him away. Sarah helped organize those details, and Jake participated in every decision. None of them wanted emotion to create another unstable situation for a dog who had already experienced too much uncertainty. The decision itself came before the paperwork. One afternoon, Daniel loaded his duffel into the back of his pickup, while Jake stood beside the shelter entrance with Ranger. Daniel was due to leave Pine Hollow the following morning and report back to his duty station. He closed the tailgate, turned, and found Ranger already walking toward the truck. The German Shepherd stopped beside the passenger door, then looked back at Jake. There was no panic in the dog's posture, no desperate pulling, only the quiet attention of a working canine waiting for direction. Jake's expression shifted. He had been watching the bond develop for weeks, in the way Ranger slept more deeply when Daniel was nearby, in the way he checked Daniel's position during walks, and in the way Daniel never asked the dog for trust he had not earned. Jake called Ranger back once. Ranger returned immediately, sat at his left side, and rested his shoulder against Jake's leg. Jake knelt slowly and removed Ranger's old working collar. Beneath the worn leather remained the scratched metal tag that had survived the entire journey. Jake held it in his palm for several seconds before looking at Daniel. He explained that Ranger would always be his partner in the part of his life that had already happened. Nothing could replace those years, and Daniel did not need to replace them. What Ranger needed now was a future that did not require him to keep waiting for the past. Jake offered Daniel the collar only after the legal transfer had been approved and Sarah had confirmed the long-term care arrangements. Daniel accepted it with more hesitation than triumph. He understood the weight of what Jake was giving him. Ranger was not a reward for solving a mystery. He was a living partner whose loyalty had already been tested farther than anyone had a right to ask. Sarah's retired working dog program received its first formal approval before Daniel left. Jake agreed to help evaluate future canines when his health improved, and Tom offered to connect the shelter with regional law enforcement units that needed responsible retirement placements. The program would begin small, but Sarah preferred that. She had learned from the winter that systems failed when people assumed someone else was watching. Now, every retired working dog entering Pine Hollow would have a documented history, an individual recovery plan, and someone responsible for following the case through placement. Ranger became the reason the program existed, though Sarah refused to turn him into a symbol while he was still learning simply to be a dog. Some mornings he still woke alert. Sometimes he paused at doors, but increasingly he chose a warm rug, an open truck window, or Daniel's quiet company instead. On Daniel's final morning, Jake stood beside the snow-lined road while Ranger waited in the pickup. Daniel held the old collar one last time and read the words scratched into the metal. "If I don't return, follow him." He looked at Jake and asked the question that had followed him since the weather station. "Did he do what you meant?" Jake glanced toward Ranger. The German Shepherd sat calmly in the passenger seat, no longer watching a shelter door, no longer searching the mountain, no longer waiting for an unfinished command. Jake smiled for the first time without sadness behind it. He did. Daniel climbed into the truck and started the engine. As Pine Hollow disappeared behind them, Ranger did not turn around. His amber eyes remained fixed through the windshield on the road ahead. Jake had his name back. Sarah had saved the shelter. Ranger had finished his mission. And Daniel, who had come to Montana looking for silence, left with something better than silence beside him. He left with trust.
Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a loyal dog, a second chance, or a stranger willing to follow when everyone else has stopped believing. Daniel, Jake, and Ranger remind us that faith often asks us to keep going before we understand where the road leads. In everyday life, never ignore the small signs of hope around you. If this story touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless you and your family always. Amen.